Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories as per usual. I hope you all enjoy them. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Of course, only if you feel that this video is deserving of it. It helps more people see the content, and it also lets me know that I'm doing a good job. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post videos just like this all of the time. Sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. My name is Eric. Well, it's not my real name, but it's my alias. I'm a known writer to some niche horror communities. I'm also still in college, but I live alone most of the time due to my ever-traveling parents. From the outside, it's easy to tell I don't talk to many people. So much so, I even think that it'd be a great challenge to find someone who knew me. I'm also a huge geek, and this will have some importance. But we'll get to that. Since I was little, I've always consumed horror media. I was more so exposed to it at first, if anything, but despite being traumatized every so often, it stuck with me. Would I show my future children the horror movies I was shown? Nope. I did seek out creepypastas in my early years despite being terrified by these short horror stories. Yes, consuming these stories was just part of the fun, but I also liked imagining myself in them, and creating my own stories which were inspired by them. I told myself throughout these experiences that I'd never be a victim if it were me. Whether it was a slasher, if there was a monster, or anything. If I could fight, I would. How exhilarating. A brave hero making a last stand against impossible odds. Sure, they might die fighting a giant machete-wielding monster, but they'll look cool in the process. Anyways, there was a girl I met at the supermarket about 3 weeks ago. She was pretty, looked no older than me, and was overly nice. On any other occasion, this would have been an absolute win, and just maybe I could sleep without feeling so alone for once. The way we met set off an alarm in my head, however, and for some reason, I didn't want to celebrate just yet. Please don't call me a loser. I haven't gotten to the geek section yet. The way we met felt a little forced. It was a cliche of bumping into a girl and picking up her books, but in this case, it was a basket of groceries. Her mannerisms were forced, or so I thought at least. She asked me a lot of basic questions, like my name and about family and whatever, things I would normally lie about and such. To my surprise, she caught me off guard with one question when she asked if I was single. When I obviously answered yes, she looked relieved. Now, I'm not a bad-looking guy, and even then, that doesn't matter all too much from the couples I've seen online or wherever, but her reaction embarrassed me a little. I also noticed beforehand that I was talking about myself. It felt like as if she already knew all that I told her. Like, this was old information to her. I don't know how else to describe it. But she wasn't pleasant to be around overall. I don't think I did anything wrong in this interaction, nor did I overshare or say anything suspicious. But afterward, I couldn't help but feel odd. If you can put 2 and 2 together, I think we all know where this is going. This was my first time meeting her, but I doubt it was her first time meeting me. I think, as in, I can't confirm it, but I basically believe she's been stalking me for a while at this point, speaking retroactively, of course. At some point, I started to notice faint scratches near the front of my door. I have one of those doors where mail can be slipped through a lot, and recently the floor was getting covered in marks where the mail would drop. I didn't think much of it then, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was using an instrument of sorts to grab my mail through the slot, causing scrapes across the floor as she did so. The suspicious activity finally crossed my threshold when I compared the pictures of successfully delivered packages versus what I saw when I arrived home to bring them inside one evening. The The package was slightly shifted from how it appeared in the picture, with several small pebbles clearly not matching up. Call me paranoid, but we aren't in a windy season. The package also opened a little easier than it should have, but maybe that's just me being me with my overthinking tendencies. Either way, from that day forward, my packages were normal. I made sure of it. It's creepy, but she must have caught on that I was catching on to her specifically. I doubt she thought that. Heck, I'd forgotten entirely about her by then. I have far too many things on my mind at all times of the day. Remember how I said my parents are always traveling? That was a bit of a lie, but I don't think it's worth explaining, or rather, they aren't worth talking about. I bring this up because I use their old room as a studio to work on several hobbies of mine, whether it be writing, drawing, or scrolling through various online communities. At the time, I was reading a story posted on a website about a protagonist who obtained a bad habit of people watching. But it was then that I heard my front door from across the house creak open and shut in the span of a second. My spine felt as if it were caressed by a ghost, but I kept my cool as much as I could, unable to forget about the odd occurrences. I truly thought someone finally had entered my house. In my studio, because I'm a geek as briefly stated earlier, I have a katana and a ninja sword type thing. Ninjas aren't real, I don't think, but I only recently figured out what this sword is meant to be, just so I could attempt to describe it here. I bring this up because I trust the sword over my katana any day of the week. The katana I have is from a mall. It's sharp, yeah, but swinging it isn't comfortable at all. The ninja sword is very sharp, probably sharper, and much easier to swing. The only downside is that it's about a foot shorter than my other blade, but beggars can't be choosers when someone just entered my house. My studio room is at the very back of the house, opposite of the front entrance. When entering the house, you need to walk through the hallway, keeping straight and passing up several rooms. The kitchen is on the left and living room on the right. Then you'd reach my studio. With my sword in hand and a hollow feeling in my chest, I gently opened the door and stared at the front entrance, wondering if I could see any signs of someone entering. Although I couldn't confirm my suspicions visually, I could tell that the door was unlocked as usual. From the corner of my eye, from behind the counter that was not far from me which separated the kitchen from the living room, I saw a silhouette charging at me. I met their gaze instantly, seeing a girl running toward me with an axe you'd buy at the supermarket. She swung the back of the axe toward my face, and I was barely able to dodge backwards with a large leap. She stood still after that initial swing hit the wall. She probably barely recognized that I had a sword in hand. I seemed to have forgotten up until then myself. In front of me was a girl about my age, a little shorter than me, who had blonde hair and blue eyes. She had a backpack strapped over black sweats. Even her sneakers were black. I could also make out the handle of a knife that crudely stuck out of her pocket. It took me a second, but I realized that this was the same girl from the supermarket I'd met a few weeks back. As for me, I couldn't move. My mind was working, but my body stood frozen as I looked at her. Sleep paralysis is the best way to describe what I was experiencing. Not being able to move, but being very capable of thought. Watching as a monster stalks you, while being unable to defend yourself. She was a girl with a small figure who held an axe. She looked innocent, but her intent was to kill me, and it disturbed me greatly. I could audibly hear my heart pumping blood throughout my body, and my chest felt a mix of tightness and emptiness. My palms were basically dripping with sweat, and my legs wanted nothing more than to drop. I tried speaking but couldn't. All that escaped were cackles that were audible only to me. I could only imagine how stupid I looked from her point of view. After what felt like an eternity of helplessness, I could move again. Right away I tried speaking but still couldn't. If anything, it made my body feel weaker, so I gave up talking altogether. I didn't know why she was here with murderous intent, but what I did know was that by looking at her face, I could tell she was pumped with adrenaline too. The sword I held was shorter and lighter than the axe. I felt confident enough in my abilities regardless, and even then, she wasn't scary in nature at all. As I said earlier, it was the context of the situation that disturbed me, not her. If she were to swing at me just as she did moments ago, no doubt I could dodge and counter her. I was only concerned if she were to perform an overhead swing once the axe weighed much more than my sword, and even then, blocking an axe looked tricky to me. She did exactly that and charged at me with the axe raised over her head. For a second I saw her smile, maybe from nervousness or from pleasure, but regardless I didn't like it. My mind basically said, screw it, and I stood my ground, taking only one step into her as she swung downward on me. I aimed for right below the blade, and as expected it crashed down on me. Still, I resisted enough for her blade to only bump the flesh between my neck and shoulder, there not being enough force to cause a cut. I had her exactly where I wanted her, and there was no doubt in my mind that I'd won. I let go of the sword with one hand and grabbed her axe that was over my shoulder. I jabbed my sword into her chest, just below the collarbone, just deep enough to scare her. I didn't see her as a real threat anymore, despite my body still shaking, and I didn't want to hurt her too badly. I should have taken the axe away from her completely, because as she jumped back in pain she tugged on it, causing a piece of its blade to hook the part of my back it was hung over. I could tell it cut me, but I was able to regain control by pulling it back toward me once more, this time swinging it to where it was no longer behind me. From there I kicked her back and was surprised at how far she fell backward. As she got up she unhooked her backpack, sliding both straps off, and promptly took the blade from her pocket. There was a smidge of blood on the tip. No wonder, looking at the way she kept it in her pant pocket. Still, she ran at me again but couldn't dream of touching me. I swung twice, once slicing her arm, and the other the back of her wrist. She dropped the knife as blood trickled down, falling onto my tile flooring. Even though I was winning, my body felt otherwise, and fear began creeping its way into me for the second time as I stared at the scene. Am I really doing this? Could I really have just died? What would she have done to me? Had her axe landed at first? She darted, thankfully not at me but toward the hallway, leaving her blood-stained backpack, knife, and axe behind. I felt more vulnerable once the door slammed shut, because I couldn't help but think that she'd come back in. She never did, though, and I stood there for 2 hours, attempting to comprehend all that had transpired. I made sure to lock the door, even the lock at the top, and brought a new change of clothes into the bathroom along with the sword. I took a long, warm shower, replaying the scene in my head over and over again. My wound only stung for a second. I guess the axe barely hooked, maybe less than a millimeter deep into my flesh. Afterwards, I cleaned up the blood, annoyed at how much there was on the floor. Soon after, I opened her backpack and found an assortment of items, things I'd rather not think about. One in particular that I will bring up, however, was her phone. The camera on my front porch, which had been turned off due to laziness up until the package incident, caught her face the day she snuck in. I took a picture of her and used it to unlock the phone's facial recognition lock. Since then, I grew obsessed looking at the various photos of the girl who tried murdering me. It was thrilling to know that she failed, and that she was living in fear, knowing very well I was alive. In just hours I'd read all her texts, all personal notes I could find, and scrolled through her socials. She was a normal girl, which confused me but added to my amazement. I wanted to learn everything about her. My blood was screaming her name. It was just like the horror novels I've read/written, and it wasn't long until I came up with the idea to finally meet this devious mistress. I was able to find wireless earbuds connected to her phone that had their tracking setting enabled. How ironic that she was so nonchalant about being tracked. I've been keenly watching her in person these past few days since then, as it didn't take long to find out where she was staying at. You seem so interesting, and I'd like to know you better, which is exactly why I'm going to leave this note at your front door. Don't bother throwing away your earbuds and fleeing. I already have a few ways to find you regardless. This isn't my first time doing something like this, but it might be my last depending on how this goes. I hope this doesn't come off as too weird, but I think you can forgive me seeing how you swung an axe at me. I don't know why you chose me. Maybe you know something, or things, about me that I don't want you to. But I'm not holding my breath on whether you'll phone the police based on that information. After all, we both have some things to hide, don't we? Otherwise, I would have simply called them by now. With love, and maybe more. Eric. P.S. This has all been therapeutic to me, and maybe I can share how I really feel when we meet up. My high school years were amazing. Sports and grades have come to me naturally, but I always struggled with one thing. Women. As a senior in high school, I never got to experience the pleasures of having a girlfriend, and I wish it stayed that way. Lana was perfect. Her almond-shaped hazel eyes and her wolf cut were the first to catch my attention. I remember her walking into the classroom and greeting our teacher. She was beautiful. My teacher must have seen me eyeing her down because the seating arrangement he gave her was the seat next to mine. The first words she ever said to me were, "Hey dude." Took me a minute to register, but I eventually responded with a quick hi. From there we hit it off and became friends. I did my best to get her adjusted to the school, and even helped her with schoolwork. Soon, we became class partners and finally broke the ice. Study sessions were where I got to know her more. She had the same energy as I did. She liked my jokes, and I liked hers. She told me how she came from another school because of her parents' work, and really appreciated my company. As time progressed, we hung out more outside of school. Often we would get food or watch movies, but only as friends. She didn't really talk to too many people, so I appreciated having her all to myself. She eventually became my best friend, and the more we talked, the more I realized how much I liked her. As homecoming was near, we decided to go as a couple. I couldn't believe that she said yes, and couldn't wait for the big night. This is where it all went wrong. As the day of homecoming approached, I grew anxious. This was the furthest I've gone with any girl. The first 3 years of high school were lonely. I always went to homecoming with a group of guy friends. Many of them congratulated me on the achievement. My mom was very proud and made sure I was ready. As the day of homecoming arrived, I was ready. My mother rented us a limo and bought me a brand new suit just for the special occasion. I called Lana before heading to her house to pick her up. She told me just how excited she was, and vice versa. Finally, arriving at her house, I knocked on her door. No response. After a few minutes, I called her. No answer. I decided that she might be in the backyard, so I crossed over through the side like I usually do. After knocking on the back door, I was relieved to hear the voice of Lana's father. "Who is it?" Lana's father opened the door with a confused look. "Can I help you?" he asked. I stated that it was me, and I was here to pick Lana up. I told her parents I could pick her up ahead of time, so I was confused at the question. Her father just stared at me like I was crazy. "I think you have the wrong house." Of course, I persisted and asked if this was some sort of joke. I remember seeing another figure walking towards the door. It was Lana's mom. She seemed very relaxed and approached the door, stating, "We don't have a daughter." I was dumbfounded. After a good minute of arguing and persisting, Lana's father told me to leave. I hesitated, thinking that they might have disapproved of me being their daughter's date, but they grew more and more aggressive. Finally accepting my fate, I stumbled across the steps as I hurried to the car. I could already feel my eyes tear up as I realized I was stood up. Why did she ghost me? Why did she tell her parents to act like that? Did I do something wrong? I had so many questions. Questions that were never answered. I lived in a relatively small town. Everyone knew each other. So when everyone claimed that this Lana girl never existed, I nearly lost it. After I went home from the incident, I cried to my mom about what happened. She looked very confused and asked me who I was talking about. I was sobbing. I told her it wasn't the time for a joke and I needed someone to talk to. But she continued asking me who I was talking about. Just like Lana's parents, I stood my ground, but the same thing happened. She forgot. It got so bad that I had to pull out my phone and show her a picture of her. Except she wasn't there anymore. Not a single trace of her was left on my phone. Her pictures, videos, and messages were all gone. Our old Instagram posts together were non-existent. More importantly, her number, which I memorized by heart, never existed. Was I dreaming? The girl that I was talking to for over half a year never existed. Did no one believe me? Or did everyone forget? That was 20 years ago. With no one to talk to or believe in me, I moved on. I later moved for college and did other things with my life. Eventually, I met my wife. She is the love of my life. We have 2 healthy boys and another on the way. I have a decent job and a happy life. My wife Emily stays home to take care of the kids. Since my work is enough to support the whole family, we often go to parenting sessions together. We weren't certain if we would be able to juggle another child, and marriage has been hard, so we decided to learn how to have a balance. It was going great. Until last week. December 2nd, 2023. It's been 2 decades since I last saw her, and that's why I'm writing this diary. I almost forgot about her after all these years, but I saw her. After our parenting session, Emily and I went to get lunch. We ate at one of those restaurants with an outside cafe. The table we sat at was adjacent to the sidewalk which pedestrians walked on. As I waited for Emily to come back from the restroom, I noticed one of the pedestrians at a distance. I wasn't able to immediately recognize her, but I knew she looked familiar. The closer she got, the more I was certain. It was her. It was Lana. She didn't age as much as I did. She looked about 30-ish and still had the same type of haircut and eye color. I couldn't believe my eyes. I don't know why, but I was scared, like she was going to do something to me. However, she seemed unaware, like she didn't see me and just kept walking. My eyes followed her as she walked down the street, eventually turning a corner. I wanted to follow her, but my wife was coming back. I thought I was hallucinating, but I was certain it was her. When we went home, I couldn't sleep. For 20 years, everyone I've talked to about Lana never believed me. It got so bad I started to think I made it all up, a way to cope with the loneliness I was facing in high school. But I was certain I saw her. January 12th, 2024. I have been skipping parenting sessions with my wife because of my busy New Year work schedule. My wife has been going alone and tending to the kids a lot more. She's been doing it well. However, she recently talked to me about a friend she made at the class. Her name is Lana. This is probably insignificant, but I haven't heard that name in a while. What really stirred me was the way my wife described her. I was a bit shaky, but reassured myself it couldn't be her since it's a relatively common name. She will be coming over for dinner in a week, so I will have my suspicions answered soon. January 19th, 2024. I don't know where to begin. I sat in the living room scared for the worst, so when my wife opened the door to the sound of Lana greeting us, I nearly passed out. It was like seeing a ghost, a mere dream from 20 years ago. My wife introduced us and quickly sat us down at the dinner table. I remained reserved. I did my best to control my emotions, not speaking for the entire dinner other than a few yeahs or no's. Lana actually seemed uninterested in me, and was getting along with my wife very much. I didn't know how to feel. She was real, right here, in front of me. After bottling my emotions, I finally built up the courage for confrontation. "Do you remember me?" I asked Lana. Both my wife and Lana turned to me confused. "Sorry?" I remember her asking. "In high school, senior year?" I asked again, this time a little bit more demanding. Lana looked confused. My wife was surprised. "You knew Lana?" I didn't answer. I never really told anyone about Lana after I moved to college, and didn't think it was important to bring up with Emily. I just looked at Lana. I wanted her to say something, anything, but she didn't, keeping the puzzled look on her face. "You disappeared," I said aggressively. My wife started getting tense, unaware why I was so persistent. Lana also started getting uncomfortable. I could just tell by the way she looked at me. There was no remorse behind those eyes. It's like she forgot, or never knew. Either way, the rest of the dinner was extremely uncomfortable. I excused myself from the table, and currently I am in my room writing this entry. Lana just left. My wife had a lot of questions. She was mad about how unwelcoming I was, but after explaining everything, she understood. It's been a very long time since I've told someone about the high school incident. My wife was very skeptical at first. Since I had no proof of knowing Lana in high school, she didn't believe me. It was only when I started telling her specific details about Lana that she started believing. I told her about her parents and a few other experiences that I'm not comfortable sharing. Emily told me she wanted to avoid Lana at parenting sessions, which is understandable, so we decided to quit the program. Emily was confused. How could someone just disappear? We decided to Google her name. There was almost nothing about her online other than a few work-related profiles. We spent 2 hours doing this with no results. My wife told me that it was getting late, so we're giving up for now. February 3rd, 2024. It's been a month and life has been as usual. We decided to stop going to parenting sessions. Since then, we haven't seen or talked to Lana. Because of that, this will probably be my last entry. I think it's best to leave it that way. We have our theories. My wife thinks she might be a ghost, but I think this is something else. But either way, I'm done worrying. It's been years and I think it's time to stop thinking about her. This is goodbye for now. February 25th, 2024. I can't sleep tonight. I got a few hours in, but I woke up from a bad dream again. This is the second time. I didn't feel like writing an entry the first time since I figured it must have just been a dream, but this one was unusual to say the least. In the dream, I saw my wife. She was far, but I could tell it was her. I started drifting towards it, unable to do anything but watch. She was smiling with her arms wide open, motioning for me to come to her. I felt happy and at peace staring into her eyes. It was like when I first met her. I knew she was perfect. She started speaking, "I love you." I wanted to say it back, but couldn't. This was a lucid dream, but I couldn't control myself. She kept saying it. "I love you, I love you, I love you." But then her voice started deforming, like she was choking. She kept staring at me. Her hands were bound at her sides, and her eyes stayed locked onto mine. I love you, I love you, I love you, she kept going. But I couldn't take it. She was choking on something. Each gasp for air ended with an I love you. A red fluid then started trickling out her mouth. Blood? I didn't know, but now she wasn't talking anymore. Her hands were on her throat, gasping for air. I couldn't do anything. I wanted to wake up, for it to end, but I could only watch. It all happened so fast. She was now on the floor, spasming and fighting for her life. I was yelling on the inside, but still unable to move. Her eyes, they were still looking into mine. Her head stayed in place, but her body shook uncontrollably. Until she stopped. I thought she was dead. I wanted to yell, to scream, to see if she's okay, but I couldn't. Her lifeless body rested on the floor. It was pure silence. All I could do was look at her corpse and couldn't take action. I prayed that she would get up, but no one heard me. Her eyes were still open. They were now rolled back. I could only see the whites of them, but her head was still facing me. I didn't know how to react. I was shaken to the core. I stared at her body for a few minutes. It was all I could do, but suddenly, she started moving again. It was like she came back to life. Her eyes rolled back to the front of her head. I could hear her joints snap, cackle, and pop back into place. She then got up and started walking towards me. I was ecstatic. I thought I lost her and was beyond relieved. But something was wrong. She was smiling, the smile you get from a funny joke. As she walked toward me, she scanned my body up and down. My wife now stood in front of me. It's almost like nothing happened, like she didn't just die and come back. Something was off. She started laughing. No, she started howling. An uncontrollable howl, like the Joker. I was so confused, until she started peeling her face off. First, she started with the top, gripping the middle of her scalp. She grabbed her own hair and tugged each side downwards. She was now hysterical, laughing so hard I could barely hear the sound of her scalp ripping open. Her skin started ripping downwards towards her nose. I could see her skull now. Blood was everywhere, covering her face and body, but she kept going. She was now at her eye level. Her face looked like a peeled tomato with two bulging eyes sticking out of it. I couldn't bear the sight, but finally, she stopped laughing. "I love you," she whispered. I couldn't even wish what I saw next on my worst enemy. She yanked the skin she ripped off and threw the long pieces on the ground. She then looked me in the eyes and laid down. I wanted it to end. I couldn't watch this anymore. She then curled up into a fetal position, like an embryo. Her body turned white, not white as in pale, but white as in Voldemort white. Her clothes disintegrated. Her body was smooth. Its features were all gone like a human morph suit. She started spasming again, but this time she wasn't talking. The two pieces of skin seemingly disappeared. I couldn't fathom what was happening. Her body was transforming. After a brief moment, features started returning. I could see her face, breasts, and hair, but it wasn't my wife. As her face started setting back in, and her hair started growing back, I knew who it was. She started getting up, with her hands covering her privates. A smile grew on her face, a sinister smile. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. "Miss me?" Lana asks. I finally woke up. It was finally over. I was sweating like a dog in summer heat when I jumped out of my bed. The time was 3 in the morning. I had only got a few hours of sleep. I quickly checked to see if my wife was okay. She was sleeping soundly. I've been replaying the dream in my head over and over. Even though it was just a dream, I told Emily how scared I felt. I have so many questions. Something tells me this isn't going to be the last time. For now, I'm going to take tomorrow off from work and relax. Maybe I just haven't been getting enough sleep. March 1st, 2024. The dreams haven't stopped. They've been mostly the same. My wife dies and Lana comes out of nowhere to scare the heck out of me. I started using melatonin to get better sleep, but it only made the dreams worse. We visited a sleep specialist yesterday, and he told us the problem could be within my subconscious. He told us the best way to solve the issue is to find and face the issue. Of course, I already knew the issue. It was Lana. I still had so many questions that were lingering within. How has she returned? We haven't talked to or seen her since the night of the dinner, so we decided to attend another parenting session to find her. Of course, she wasn't there. I wasn't very surprised, but my wife assured me we would find her eventually. As of now, we have had zero luck. March 3rd, 2024. Still no luck. We've gone to sessions every day for the past couple days and haven't seen her. We asked the staff if they have seen her, but they told us she stopped coming about the time we stopped as well. My wife thought this was a coincidence, but this is nothing new to me. The dreams have been getting worse, and I fear for my own health. I have been consistently waking up in the middle of the night, sweating and yelling. I need to fix this soon. March 5th, 2024. It's currently 2 a.m. I had another bad dream. Usually I would be bound to something, unable to talk and forced to watch my wife die while Lana appears. I was already used to the routine. It sounds messed up, but I've grown used to seeing my wife die in the worst ways possible. So far, she's ripped off her own skin, set herself ablaze, and shot herself in the head. I hated every minute of it, but I've become desensitized. Lana would always appear shortly after Emily died. I didn't understand why, since I never thought about Lana on a daily basis. But this one was different. Emily cut her stomach open and spilled her guts over the floor. Nothing unique, but this time Lana had walked in early. She didn't appear from Emily's corpse like she sometimes did, but she rather walked in from outside of my view. This time she approached Emily, still bleeding to death, and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Shortly after, Emily was lifeless, and Lana turned her head towards me like she usually did. She walked over to me and started smiling, like she usually did, but this time she touched me. She touched my lips, circling between the top and bottom, but that wasn't the part that concerned me. I could feel it. It was only a dream, I told myself, but I knew this was different. She read me, like she was staring into my soul, like she knew what I was thinking. I didn't know how to react. I couldn't. I wanted to die at that moment. Until she said the words, "See you soon," and gave me a light shove. That's all I could remember. I woke up and now I am writing this entry. I woke my wife up and told her what happened as well. Now we both can't sleep and seriously don't know what to do. My wife has booked me an appointment for the psychiatrist tomorrow. I think it's for the best. March 5th, 2024, Part 2. After my wife booked me an appointment for tomorrow, we decided to watch a movie. We couldn't sleep and didn't know what else to do. About halfway through the movie, I heard a tap on one of the living room windows. It sounded like a rock. I ignored it, too wary to check, but another tap came shortly after. This time both my wife and I went to check, peering out the window. We couldn't see anything since it was too dark. I didn't know what to do, feeling like a child wanting to stay in the safety of my home. My wife told me not to worry, and how it was probably a couple of pranksters up late at night. But a couple seconds later, there was a loud banging on our back door. I feared for the worst. I grabbed my shotgun from the bedroom safe. I've never had to use it before. My wife said I was overreacting, but after experiencing the dream, I was not taking risks. Shaking in fear, I headed towards the back door and told my wife to stay behind me. I turned on the backyard lights and listened for sound. It was super quiet since it was late at night, but I still didn't hear anyone in the yard. After a few minutes of waiting by the door, I finally got the courage to prop it open and check to see what was there. Of course, there was nothing unusual. The backlight dimly revealed the backyard, illuminating the barbecue grill and the silhouette of 2 trees. Other than that, I saw nothing else. To reaffirm my safety, I hesitantly called out, "Anyone there?" My wife was clutching my hand behind me, but I was confident no one was there. Until someone replied, "I'm here." At first I thought it was our elderly neighbor, but the voice was younger and higher pitched. The voice was familiar. My wife instantly jumped back. I think she realized before I did. It was Lana. I couldn't see her at first, but I knew. Her shadow was hiding under one of the trees. I only saw it when it started moving towards me. A dark shadow hovered on the ground, slowly edging its way toward my wife and I. I immediately raised my gun, realizing there was nothing I could see that was making the shadow. Its shape narrowed as it shifted from the light. It was moving by itself. It finally stopped about 10 feet away from us. The shadow then grew bigger, about as wide as a sewer plate. I pointed my gun at the thing, but I didn't know what I was aiming at. Before I could think, a hand appeared from the void. It reached for the grass and started pulling itself out. Along came an arm, then a head, and then a full body. The figure had long hair and tattered clothes. Its skin was rotten like a corpse. My wife quickly pulled out her phone and called the police. I was now face to face with the thing, but my gun was the only protection I had. After taking a closer look, I recognized her. It was Lana, but her body seemed semi-decomposed, like she was a zombie. She just stood there menacingly. I wanted to shoot, but I couldn't. There was nothing behind those eyes. Her face rose and met mine, then she lifted her arm towards me, reaching for my face. Her dry and cracked lips started moving, with only a groan coming out of her mouth. My wife, who was still behind me, told me that the police would be here soon. I didn't hear her, hyper-fixated on Lana's next move. Lana was unresponsive, like a statue, but then she started moving. I could see her plant her foot into the ground, ready to charge. "Don't do it," I warned her, but she ignored me and started rushing. My wife screamed, seeing the sudden movement of Lana. She was fast, so fast that I almost didn't pull the trigger in time. My shotgun sent Lana flying. Bits of her body flew through the air as blood spewed everywhere, like a piñata. The sight was gruesome. I stood there, realizing I had just shot someone. The sirens of the police were now only a few houses away, and I turned to tell my wife to get them. But she must have already gone, to tell the police what happened. As I was waiting, I moved closer to the remains of Lana. I wanted to have closure, to make sure it was over. But when I approached the body, I noticed something wrong. The hair was different. This wasn't Lana's hair. This was my wife's. I flipped the body over only to see my dead wife's face, eyes still open, with a look of horror. I shot my wife. I could hear the police breaking down the front door, but I didn't know what to do. In the heat of the moment, my legs started moving, running. I ran across the backyard and jumped over the fence to my neighbor's yard, then the next yard, and then the next. I ran until sunrise. I am currently staying at a friend's house 30 miles away from home. My kids? I can't go back. There will be a hunt for me soon. What have I done? March 8th, 2024. The dreams are still here and have become a lot worse. I fear for my children, but there's nothing I can do. The police are on search for me. I thought about turning myself in, but I couldn't do it. I stayed at a friend's house for a couple nights until the bounty for me was released. I can't sleep at all anymore. But I know what I saw that night. Lana was there. This might be the only documentation I have of Lana's existence, but I want the world to know. For me, this is the end. I refuse to live like this. I'm currently at the top of a skyscraper and I think I'm gonna jump. I don't know if I'm gonna go through with this, but I will update y'all if I don't. This is me signing off now. Goodbye. Uncle Felix was always the kindest man. He'd bring me and my little brother, Scotty, a present every time we visited. Always interesting things. A rope necklace with what he claimed was a dinosaur knuckle hanging from it. A real pearl he'd found on one of his many overseas trips. And who could forget the taxidermied rat dressed in a tuxedo that Mother threw out? He had a square jaw, a bald head, and a loud laugh. Always a slap on the back for Father, a kiss on the cheek for Mother, and Aunt Cal would follow him in beaming with a Tupperware container of pasta or lasagna. Uncle Felix was the sort of overly friendly uncle that would merit a raised eyebrow if mentioned. It was always seen as creepy for an uncle to love his niece and nephew. But Felix and Cal had no children of their own, and they were more like second parents to me. The news that Felix and Cal were taking a trip to the Great Basin Desert was no surprise to me. They were always off somewhere. In fact, I did not know until they had left. But once their week-long trip turned into 2, then 3, the missing posters began to sag in the rain, and the police report went stale. 2 weeks ago, Mother and Father were about to prepare us for the news that Felix and Cal might never return, a fact I had already accepted but Scotty had not. When the phone rang, Father sighed and got up to answer it. His voice turned from disbelieving to relief, then worry. He took the phone upstairs to his study, where he continued to talk in a hushed whisper. Scotty, Mother, and I all sat at the kitchen table, waiting for news of what was happening. Father called Mother to come up. About half an hour had passed. I could hear raised voices. When they came down, Father herded Scotty and I into the kitchen for a family meeting. He sat us down with a very serious look on his face. Uncle Felix has returned from the desert. He was found wandering in Alaska, disoriented and lost. Auntie Cal has not been found yet. Felix has been in hospital for 3 days, and he'll remain there for 2. After that, he'll be coming to stay with us for a while. Scotty and I were happy Felix was back and would be staying here, but the loss of Cal was a shock. Scotty began to cry. I held him. The desert was not kind to Uncle Felix. You are not to ask him any questions about what happened there. Mentioning Auntie Cal around him is strictly forbidden. Do you understand me? We nodded. We had never seen our father like this. So urgent and snappy. Felix has a small scar on his face now. You are not to ask him about this either. And if you start seeing anything, if anything changes, you tell me. Do you understand me? The night before Felix was going to arrive, I was eavesdropping on Mother and Father, arguing in hushed voices in their room. What else was I to do? They refused to give me any more details. I told you this is a bad idea. We are putting our children in danger. He is my brother, Kate. We take him in no matter what. He got lost in the Great Basin and ended up in Alaska. Something terrible happened. And to bring Felix here is dangerous. What if we get displaced too? You should have taught Lee and Scotty about this. About what happens to people in your family. This is over. It's settled. I know how to be more careful than Felix. If something arrives with him, if something tries to displace us, I will stop it. Did your dad teach you that? The crazy one who tried to fight them? He got marked. just like Felix. And then they came for him. Him and you and Felix. Do not bring Dad into this. Father's voice had a hollow danger in it that ended the argument. I crept back to my room. For the first time, I did not feel entirely safe. Not at all. That argument was proof that my parents may not be able to protect me and Scotty. I was afraid. Scotty and I watched out of my window the next morning, waiting for Felix's car. A few passed our house that looked similar to his, but my nervous excitement fizzled out as they kept on driving, until, at last, a taxi pulled up and a tall, broad-shouldered man with the hood pulled up on his sweater climbed out. Scotty and I fought over who would be first to greet him. Father broke us up and answered the door. Felix stepped inside, and I rushed to hug him, but stopped when I saw his face. A small scar? Father had to be joking. The entire left side of Uncle Felix's handsome face was burnt. His left eye was missing. His ear was gone, and worse by far, the scar had melted his cheek to the bone, so that his teeth were exposed, twisting the left side of his mouth into a permanent, mangled grin. The flesh surrounding it was a raw pink, tight and shiny. Scotty gave him a trembling hug, as did I. It was still kind old Uncle Felix, even though he was scarred, even though he did not hug us back, or crack a joke about Father's thinning hair, or even smile. Dinner was eaten quietly. We brushed our teeth. We went to bed at the time we were supposed to. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't fix. Uncle Felix's eyes were hollow, his breathing slow. A terrible sadness hung around him, a darkness that blocked out light. I cried that night. It felt as though I had lost Felix as well as Cal, even though he was here. I tried to close my eyes and go to sleep, but something woke me. It was only a slight disturbance, nothing more, but my eyes snapped wide open. I sat up in bed, and stayed like that for some time. I needed fresh air, I decided. My window jammed, and while I stood there trying to rattle it open, I glanced outside. Something was there, just beyond the tree line of the forest that stretched for miles behind my town. It was almost invisible, crouching in the rippled moonlight filtering through the trees. I could only see half of it, the trunk of an oak tree almost obscuring it. I caught a glimpse of a pale shoulder and a flash of black feathers. It wasn't looking at me, its vision instead fixed on the patio. I hadn't noticed, but Uncle Felix sat there, lounging in a deck chair, a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. He didn't see me. He was staring back at the thing, defiance in his remaining eye. What was he doing? The patio door flung open and Father rushed outside. He grabbed Uncle Felix by the shoulders and shook him. He was yelling something I couldn't hear. Father hurried him inside, casting a fearful glance towards the forest where the creature was now gone. Father's instructions the next morning were clear. Do not leave the house, under any circumstances. Scotty didn't understand why. Mother sat in stony resolution, and Uncle Felix looked annoyed. It turned out, we didn't need to leave the house. The thing found us anyways. I woke with a jerk in the middle of the night. Whatever had woken me was still there. I could feel it, a presence that scraped against my mind. My closet door was ajar, the horrible cliché I had seen too many times in horror movies. I didn't want to look, but I had to. It was crouched half inside my closet, moonlight from the open window glinting off its puffy, pale skin. It was swollen, bloated, like it had been soaked in water. Molting black feathers were stuck in its shoulders, like the creature was made of clay and someone had poked them roughly in, leaving spaces in between. 2 black eyes bulged like tumors from its face. It waved at me. A sick, sour taste spread up my throat. I raised my hand hesitantly, before changing my mind. its pulpy features twisted into a frown. I was about to call for father or mother, but Uncle Felix opened my door. The creature's face lit up with a gleeful grin when it saw me. Felix walked calmly into my room, picked me up and slung me over his shoulder and walked out. I did not struggle, nor did I ask what was happening. I trusted Uncle. The second we were out into the passage, Uncle Felix sprinted. He ran with me out the front door. At this point I began to scream, and threw me roughly into the back seat of Mother's car, where Scotty sat also, tears running down his cheeks. Felix ran back into the house, leaving the car door open. I slammed it shut. "Did you see it too?" Scotty's voice wavered. All I could do was sit in silence. I was also crying. Mother shoved me into the middle seat, then sat behind me. Father drove, and Uncle Felix tore at his nails in the passenger seat. Father's gun rested in his lap. When we ran out of gas, it was nearly 2 a.m. Father recited every swear word he knew. Mother dug her nails into her arm until it bled, and Felix rested his head on his knees. "You are not to leave the car." Felix hissed at us. "I will handle this." "You were marked by it. You leave this car, you won't come back." Father sounded so angry that I feared the gun lying in his lap would come into use. The worst thing that could have happened next promptly happened. Scotty, poor terrified Scotty, flung his door open and ran into the night. What I did next made our situation much worse. But what else was I to do when my 8-year-old brother was out there alone? I ran after Scotty. The darkness was disturbingly thick, like clouds of swirling tar. I screamed for Scotty over and over again. A faint howl was my only response. My throat was raw. A stitch in my side doubled me over, and my lungs felt fit to explode when I came across Scotty. He was lying on the ground, his arms covering his head, and above him, hundreds of birds, all black crows, ravens, blackbirds, starlings, dive-bombed him. Their shrill caws tore the night in two, their beaks and claws cutting into Scotty as they dived at him. There were so many that it was as if the darkness had come alive, a shrieking, whirling cloud of feathers. I tried to run to him, to help, but the birds drew me back. My arms bled where they had clawed me, and when I saw it, in a gap between two wings, in the center of the swirling cloud of black, a single white bird hovered. Where its wings met its body, there were black feathers. Its eyes were black too, like shiny glass. They were fixed on the darkness behind me, where Uncle Felix skidded to a halt. His scar made the left side of his face look ghastly in the low light. "Come for me." Felix's voice sounded so broken, so sad. The white bird dived for him. The screaming black flock followed closely behind. Felix ran. I went to Scotty, who lay whimpering, bleeding from hundreds of puncture marks where the birds had attacked him. I heard running footsteps. It was Father, who picked up Scotty and I, and tore back to the car. He bundled us into the back seat. "Kate?" Mother was loading the shotgun, walking back the way we had come. The darkness yawned around her, swallowing her like a greedy mouth. "Stay there," was all she said to us. 10 minutes passed. 15. We sat in the back seat, Father in the front. We stayed deathly silent. I had so many questions, but they were stillborn as I changed my mind each time I opened my mouth. I heard a shot, then another. After 20 minutes had gone by, something shifted in the darkness. It was Mother, a grim expression on her face. Blood trickled from her nose. A bird hung from her hand by its feet, a gaping, ragged hole in its chest. Red blood was tarred across its white feathers. Mother threw the shotgun into Father's lap. She slammed the bird down onto the dashboard. I'll sleep in my own bed for the remainder of tonight. I write this at my window, watching the bonfire mother and father have lit. They're burning the white bird's body, and Uncle Felix's things, too. Scotty sits beside me. The birds cut his arms and chest up pretty bad, but they didn't get his face or neck. He's upset that his favorite shirt got torn up. I'm upset that Uncle Felix won't be coming back. My closet door is shut, in case you were wondering. Scotty's favorite toy, a stuffed raven, the last gift Uncle Felix gave him, is being burnt too. He doesn't want it in his room. Father has promised to tell me more about what happened. Scotty will know too when he is old enough. I'll edit this if I get the chance. In the wake of my mother's death, my father became obsessed with life. It shocked no one when Mom passed, given her proclivities for smoking, drinking, and gorging herself, but the drawn-out nature of her death surprised me. I thought that death by cardiovascular disease meant keeling over and dying suddenly of a heart attack. Instead, she withered away over the course of many difficult years. I was 8 when she passed, and my dad became a whole new person in the aftermath. He grew obsessed with health and longevity. An innocuous fixation at first, but one that quickly spiraled out of control. One morning, weeks after her death, my dad shook me awake at 4 a.m. and drove us to a lake a few miles from our house. He dragged me down to the shore and pushed me into the cold water, and I was certain for a moment that he was lost to bereavement psychosis, about to drown me and then himself. Instead, he jumped into the water beside me and started droning on about the health benefits of cold plunges. I was so distracted by the cold that most of what he said was lost on me, but I remember the last thing he said before we got out. "We're not gonna be like her," he told me. "We're gonna live a long, long time, you and me." He pulled a lot of similar stunts after that. It felt like every week there was some new method he wanted to try out with me. Some of them more scientifically backed than others. A few of them I grew to like. Clean eating, meditation, sauna therapy. Others I wasn't a fan of. Cold water plunges, detox diets, acupuncture. Some were deeply unpleasant. Extended fasting, sleep deprivation therapy, bloodletting. The worst of them I loathe to mention, even all these years later. I wasn't a big fan of my dad's obsession, and wouldn't you know it, neither was CPS. By 14, I was the pinnacle of physical health, but my mental health had taken a sharp decline, and my extended family finally took notice. In the end, my dad didn't have to serve any jail time, but he did lose custody over me, and I was sent to live with my aunt for the remainder of my childhood. He moved out of state to work with an OCD specialist on his problems. Life moved on. I did well for myself in high school and eventually college, maintaining good grades and running cross-country for a D1 team. I met an architecture student named Daniela, who became my wife after we graduated. My dad never called, never wrote, never visited. I was convinced that he was dead, and the thought filled me with both relief and despair. As a tribute to him, I revisited some of the old activities we used to do together. I despised them, but when I tried to stop, I was overcome by a terrible sense of guilt. By the time I graduated college, I had an impressive cold tolerance, a BPM of 38, and more week-long water fasts under my belt than I could count. Eventually, my wife and I moved back to my hometown. My aunt had managed to hang on to my childhood home, renting it out until I had the money and maturity to come back and claim it as my own. The day I married Danny was the happiest day of my life. But the day I signed the deed and carried her across the threshold to our home was the proudest. We were 26 when she had our son. and I couldn't have been more ready to be a parent. I was blessed with the chance to become the kind of father I never had, and I promised myself that I wouldn't waste that chance. We named him August. 4 years later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I saw the last person I ever expected to find on my porch. My dad. He had a suitcase in his hands and a smile on his face. "There he is," he said, immediately pulling me into a hug. I was speechless. I recognized him instantly, but the past 16 years had taken a profound toll on him. He was sallow and bald, rake-thin and unsteady on his feet. His eyes had the same piercing quality they'd always had, but despite his lucidity, I could tell that he was very ill. He eventually let me go, and as if to confirm my suspicions, he said, "Come on now, you won't invite a dying man inside?" Once the shock of his appearance and his morbid news wore off enough for me to move again, I let him inside our home. He set down his suitcase in the living room and took a seat on the couch, taking in the room while I nervously sat on the chair across from him. "You sure gutted the place. Hardly recognize it from the inside." He gestured disapprovingly at the home Danny and I worked so hard to make our own. "Wanted to remove all traces of your old man before you moved in, did you?" I didn't humor the contentious question. Instead, I asked him what he was doing there, and with all the nonchalance of someone commenting on the weather, he told me that he had a glioblastoma. He had been fighting the cancer for years, undergoing surgeries, radiation, and chemotherapy to no avail. Eventually, it all became too much, and my dad, who had never given up on anything in his life, finally decided to throw in the towel. "They said I've got a few months at most," he said with a laugh. "Ain't it ironic? All that work just for God to snap his fingers and send me to an early grave anyway." He gave me a sad, wistful look, and for the first time, he looked like the dad I knew before my mom's death. "I know it's been a long time, son, and I know I haven't been there for you, but I'm hoping that, with the little time I have left, I can finally start making up for it." I accepted immediately. He was still my dad, no matter how rocky our relationship had been, and I certainly wasn't going to cast him aside now that he was so ill. Poor Danny was in for a shock when she came home from work, but she hid her surprise much better than I did, and welcomed my dad graciously into our home. The three of us ate dinner together, and then I set my dad up in our guest bedroom as Danny put our 4-year-old to sleep. "Are you sure you're okay with all this?" Danny asked me later as we tucked into bed. "Me? I was about to ask you the same thing." I laughed, but Danny didn't laugh along with me. Instead, she regarded me very seriously, her hand reaching out to trace along the phlebotomy scars on my arms. I promised her that she and August were still my top priority, but it did little to ease her disquiet. Unsure how to comfort her, I eventually drifted off into an uneasy sleep. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was in a meat locker, laying on the cement floor while a faceless butcher flayed me with a curved blade. I screamed and fought, but my torturer didn't stop until every inch of my flesh was exposed to the freezing air. Once he was finished, he grabbed one of the hanging carcasses by its leg and brought the knife to its stomach, slicing a long, vertical slit into the meat. Letting the knife clatter to the floor, the butcher dug both of his ungloved hands into the slit, then violently pulled them apart. He inclined his head towards my writhing form, pointing towards the hole in the carcass in a wordless question. "Coming in?" I woke up with a jolt, sweaty and sick to my stomach from the nightmare, which had been so vivid that I had to take a few moments to ensure my skin was still attached to my body. Once I had steadied myself, I got out of bed and made myself presentable. I found Danny cooking breakfast in the kitchen. My dad was there too, sitting at the table and helping August cut up his pancakes and strawberries. The sight of three of them sharing a happy moment together made my heart soar. Forgetting my dream, I joined them, cooking and sharing stories of the past 16 years with my father. It was a perfect morning. I enjoyed having my dad in my life again, but his rapidly declining health was difficult to contend with. I did my best to care for him while still giving him privacy and autonomy. Deep down, although I knew it was unfair, I couldn't help but be frustrated by his weakness. So it was all for nothing. I wanted to scream at him. You put us both through all that, all those years, just so you could leave me again? Instead, though, I put on my brightest smile and tried to make his days as easy as possible. I had learned nothing from all those fasts, if not restraint. I was prepared to watch someone's body shut down. I had my mother to thank for that, but I was unprepared to witness the deterioration of my dad's mind. His personality fluctuated often and violently. Sometimes I had my old man back, the witty, caring father who had provided so dotingly for my mother and me. Other times he was depressed and lethargic, reluctant to rise from his bed or even acknowledge my presence when I brought him food and medicine. Sometimes he was the dad from my adolescence. "You're letting yourself go, Sawyer," he said to me one night as I helped him into bed. "All you do is sit at your desk and eat. Your mother was like that too. In the end, murdered by her own sloth." I started running more after that. What was more difficult to deal with than my dad's criticism was his newly developed habit of sleepwalking. One night, I woke up in the dark to a figure standing over my bed. Barely holding in my shout, I quickly turned on my bedside table lamp and saw my father staring down at me. He looked awful, exhausted and fearful and disoriented. His thin skin looked too tight on his body, like a bone might poke through at any moment. Honestly, when I saw him, I wanted nothing more than to pull the covers up over my head and hide, but I forced myself out of bed. My dad had taken care of me for so many years. It was the least I could do to guide him back to his room. He mumbled the whole time, as had become his habit. Most of it was nonsense, but sometimes I caught a word or two about a deal. As the weeks passed, my nightmares continued. Sometimes the faceless man in my dreams was a butcher, sometimes a doctor, sometimes a mechanic. Sometimes I was in an operating room, sometimes my childhood bedroom, sometimes the banks of the lake my dad used to take me to. No matter who he was or where the dream took place, it always unfolded the same way. I'd be slowly skinned, and then the faceless man would invite me somewhere. A carcass, a crevice, a shell, a tear, a hole, coming in, he'd ask. And then I'd wake up aching all over. After one such night, I awoke before Danny and went to wake August up for kindergarten. At 4 years old, August was good-tempered and easy to entertain. A genuinely sweet, smart kid. He was the light of my life. Danny's too. And we were both admittedly guilty of spoiling him. I made my way into his room, softly calling out his name as I turned on his light, and saw something that made my heart stop. There was blood in the corner of his mouth. Panicking, I ran to his bed and gently shook him awake, asking him what had happened. He was groggy and confused, unable to answer my questions. I dabbed the crusted substance off his lips with a damp cloth, but there were no scratches beneath the dried blood. I thought he might have bitten his tongue. Unlikely though it seemed, but even when I procured a flashlight and looked inside his mouth, I couldn't find any signs of injury. Regardless, I told Danny what had happened, and she offered to take him to the pediatrician since she had the morning off. We figured that no harm could come from having a professional check him out. After my wife and son left, I went to check in with my father only to discover that he was already out of bed. I found him in the dining room, staring out the window at Danny's car as it pulled out of the driveway. "Everything all right?" he asked without taking his gaze off of the window. "I think so," I said, reaching into the fridge for the pitcher. I offered my dad some water, and he gave me a small nod in answer. I poured cold water into a glass and made my way over to the table. I set it down before him, and then he wrapped his hand around the glass. I studied that hand for a full minute, confused at first and then unnerved. "What happened to your hand?" I asked. My dad pulled his eyes away from the window to look down at the angry slit running up the pad of his thumb. "Cut it a few days ago. Happened when Daniela and me were making dinner." No, he hadn't. I would have noticed. I would have bandaged it for him, and the cut looked too fresh besides. "Dad?" I took a step forward. "Were you in August's room this morning?" His sharp eyes met mine. He studied my face for a moment, then his head tilted ever so slightly to the side. A faintly disappointed expression overtook his features. It made the scars on my arm sting. "You know, Sawyer, you really take after your mother." He raised the glass to his lips and drank. When he finished, he set it on the table with a sigh, announcing that he was tired. I helped him to bed, and then I took a very long run. I didn't mention his thumb again, but I did start locking his door at night. The days dragged on, and my dad got worse. Danny grew withdrawn. The faceless man's visits became more frequent. "Coming in?" I nearly jumped out of my own skin. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was in the kitchen with Danny as she flayed a fish for our lunch. "What?" I asked her a bit too loud. "Are you coming to the inn?" She repeated slowly. "The one downtown, remember? Where my firm's hosting that dinner? My sister said she can take August for the night." Danny's knife slipped under the fish's skin. It yielded with ease, peeling away in long sheets to reveal the meat beneath. The room suddenly felt very hot. I opened my mouth, fully intent on responding, but instead I doubled over, both hands coming to rest on my knees, and retched. I stayed home that night, though I had to convince Danny I was well enough to care for both my son and my father on my own. With some reluctance, she left for her company dinner just after dark. I spent my evening playing with August. Never before had I been so grateful to have him around. Although my nerves were a wreck and my body ached, being around my son made me feel lighter. He was such a good kid, so curious and joyful. When he had tired himself out from crawling around and playing with his toys, I put him into his crib for the night, took a deep breath, and then went to check in on my dad. I found him in his bed, propped up in a sitting position and staring at the door like he's been waiting for me. Perhaps he had, for the minute I stepped into the guest room, he began to speak. "Come here," he instructed. There were no lights on in the room, just the ambient light from the moon and stars spilling in through the windows. Figuring he preferred it that way, I walked into the dark room and took a seat on the edge of his bed. Outside, it had begun to storm. "I tried so many things," he began. "So many things, and look where they got me. All those routines, all that restriction. None of them could stop my own cells from destroying each other. Didn't stop me from looking, though. I kept searching after my diagnosis, searching for anything that could give me more time. And you know what, son? I found it." I looked at him as he spoke, finding myself squinting involuntarily. Despite being seated so close, I couldn't see his face very well. What did you find?" "Someone who could help. For a price, of course, but nothing in this world comes for free. Your old man taught you that, didn't he? You gotta tear your body apart if you want it to grow back stronger, healthier." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. No one else can really understand the deal I made anyway. But I don't have much time left, and before I go, I need you to tell me. He leaned forward and all I could see of his face was a glint of teeth. Do you want to know how to live forever? Feeling a pang of anger at the question, I shook my head. No? My dad asked, the surprise palpable in his voice. No, Dad, Christ. You are still more concerned about cheating death than you are about appreciating the life you've lived. Even now. You've missed out on so much because of this obsession. I've worked hard for what I have now, for this house and my job and Danny and August. If I lived forever, there'd be no meaning to any of it. So no, I don't want to know. And I don't want to hear any more about deals and death and immortality right now. My dad didn't say anything for a moment, and then he gave me a humorless chuckle. All right, he said, reclining back against the pillows. You're still young, Sawyer. Life hasn't beat a healthy fear of death into you yet, like it has to me. You'll come around one day, and when you do, you just let me know that you're ready for an answer, and I'll give you one. I shook my head at his nonsense, but said nothing. He was too far gone to argue with. Maybe he had been since that morning at the lake. Instead of trying to convince him, I placed my hand atop his and listened to the rain. After everything he and I had been through, it was nice to simply exist beside him. I sat there all night in silence, turning his offer over and over in my mind, when at last the storm ceased and the light of dawn broke through the darkness. I looked upon my dad's face and knew that he had died. To this day, I regret the fact that I did not know the exact time of death, nor do I know how long I was holding his hand after he was already gone. Before I called EMS, I went to check in on my family. Danny was asleep in our bed, tired from her night out. I gave her a light kiss on the cheek before making my way to August's room. When I opened the door, I found my son sitting up in his bed, staring at the door frame in much the same way my father had. You alright, buddy? August did not respond. Instead, he gave me a small, self-satisfied smile. If he weren't a toddler, I might have described it as a smirk. He reclined from the seated position until he was lying flatly, though he never stopped staring at me, even as I backed into the hall and closed the door again. Things never quite returned to normal after my dad's death. A part of me had thought that I'd feel relief once he was gone. Instead, I was consumed by loss. The house seemed to triple in size once he died. Every room seemed colder. I might have thought that the house was haunted if that terrible emptiness I felt didn't follow me everywhere. No matter where I went, I felt untethered from reality, like a ship lost at sea, too far from any shore to let down its anchor. The months I had spent with my dad had changed me in ways I didn't like, and my relationships suffered because of it. I lost friends in the years that followed, and though neither of us wanted to admit it, Danny and I lost our spark as well. We grew apart more and more over time, but we agreed to stay together for the sake of our son. If you had told my 19-year-old self that I would ever feel anything other than the pure infatuation for Danny, I would have called you a liar. And yet, there I was. Here I am. The most significant change of all was in August. August, who had once been the friendliest boy I knew, but who started picking fights with other kids during recess. August, who used to beg me for hours to read to him before bed, but who began to want nothing to do with me. He's a smart kid, well-spoken and self-sufficient, but as he grows older, so too does he grow crueler. These days, he's less like an elementary schooler and more like a teenager, and a mean-spirited, sarcastic one at that. I'm not sure where my kid went, or why he left me on the same night that my dad did, but God, do I miss him. I miss them both. This morning, I woke August up and invited him on a trip to the lake with me. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe I thought that it would bring me some clarity. Or maybe I was just hoping for a chance to bond with my son. Whatever the case, he accepted my offer, and so we loaded ourselves into the car and drove to the same lake my dad had first taken me to when I was 8 years old. It was a cold but beautiful day. There were no other cars around, and so I parked right on the bank. I stepped out of the car into the bracing morning, walking down the shore with my son close behind me. Once we made it to the water's edge, August picked up a smooth rock from the shore and flung it towards the water. It was an impressive throw, and the rock skipped a full quarter of the lake's length before finally sinking beneath the surface. I wondered where he'd learned how to do that. "Your grandpa used to take me out here," I told him. I had planned to follow up the statement with a happy memory of my dad and I at the lake, but none came to mind. Instead, I stood there in awkward silence, towing the sand at my feet as August searched for more stones. "How'd Grandpa die?" August asked suddenly, watching his pebble as it skipped across the surface of the water. "Cancer. He had a tumor in his brain." Skip. "Why didn't he just cut it out?" "I'm sure he tried, and every other cure under the sun. Your grandpa, he was a bit of a health nut, actually. Completely obsessed with living a long life. He once asked me..." I trailed off, considering whether it was appropriate to share my father's last words with my 8-year-old son. But when I looked over, August was giving me his full attention, and that occurrence was such a rarity that I was encouraged to finish. "He once asked me if I wanted to know how to live forever." "What did you say?" "I said no." "Why?" Why indeed. My dad had been right. I was young and stupid when he'd asked me that question. I had thought that I had all the time I needed. I thought I would be forever satisfied with what I had. The past 4 years had made me doubt my contentment. But I couldn't tell August that. I couldn't set him down the same path that my dad had gone down. Couldn't leave him forever unsatisfied with the time he had left. "Because there'd be no meaning to life if we were all immortal," I finally answered. August looked as unconvinced as I felt. He looked out at the far bank of the lake, his expression solemn. He appeared far beyond his years. "What about you, August? Do you want to know how to live forever?" He looked back at me slowly, smiling that self-satisfied smile. When he locked eyes with me, he gave me a wink. "I already do." He took off from me then, running until he was knee-deep in cold water before diving inside. My father's last words played on repeat in my mind as I watched him breach the surface, yelling and laughing with glee despite the frigidness. My scars burned hot with the knowledge that whatever I had done had not been enough. In that moment I knew. "Hey!" he shouted at me from the water. "Coming in?" Scritch, scritch, scritch. Thunk, thunk, thunk. That's Pepper at the back door. Oh no. I lurched forward from sleeping position and swung my feet from the couch to the tiled floor of the living room. My phone, which must have been laying on my chest while I napped, catapulted towards the end of the couch where my feet rested a second ago. I was standing before my eyes fully opened. How long had I been asleep? And, more importantly, how long had I left Pepper in the backyard? The living room was dark. The whole house was. I looked towards the kitchen and saw that even the lights above the stove, which I always kept on, weren't shining. The oven display below, even absent, its little neon green strikes spelling out the time. The power must be out. As if to punctuate that thought, a silent flash of lightning illuminated the living room, bathing everything in electric white. In that second, I saw Pepper's silhouette outside, tall and strong and pressed against the sliding glass door. his sleek, muscular Doberman build propped up on one back leg. He'd lost the other to an infection last year, and padding urgently at the door. Scritch, 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 thunk, thunk, thunk. That obnoxious, oversized collar I'd gotten him tapped against the glass as he pawed, begging to be let in from the rain. It's raining. He's been out in the rain for God knows how long, and I've just been laying here sleeping without a care in the world. I stepped across the living room to the door, still in that hazy place between sleep and awake, fueled by muscle memory and instinct instead of conscious thought, but without the need for light because this was common to me. 3 steps, hand to handle, pull right, Pepper barrels in or out, and he did. As soon as the gap between the door and the frame was big enough, Pepper squeezed through into the living room. Instead of launching straight onto the couch upon re-entry, which seemed more a rule than a routine at this point, he hightailed it past me, turning sharply where the little breakfast bar ended, and into the corridor which ran through the kitchen and into the dining room, nails clicking on the tiles as he went. Then came a creak, the basement door swinging outward, undoubtedly nosed open by a sopping wet Pepper, followed by quick, hollow thumping as he descended the haphazard wooden stairs into the unfinished basement. A roar of thunder crashed through the half-open sliding glass door and I slammed it shut. The entire series of events, waking up, noticing the power was out, letting Pepper in, and hearing him scurry down into the basement had probably taken 25 seconds start to finish. But now the urgency had bled out of the situation and I stood alone, or so I thought, in the living room, rubbing the last crumbs of sleep from my eyes and ready to rejoin the world of the entirely awake. He must be real upset with me. I began brainstorming ways to make it up to Pepper, to apologize in dog language for leaving him out in the rain, and all of them started by coaxing him out of the basement with a handful of treats. The dried salmon skin probably, stinky, high-reward stuff. It was still nearly pitch black in the living room and my eyes hadn't yet adjusted. I moved back towards the couch, leaned forward, and plopped an open palm onto the cushion, sliding across the fabric in search of my phone. Its flashlight would help me find the treats, and the treats would get Pepper out of the basement and into a warm towel. My hand groped across the center cushion and down towards the far side of the couch where my feet had been resting a moment ago. And there they bumped into something. Something warm and smooth and trembling. Whatever it was recoiled slightly when I touched it, but settled back into my palm. Then I felt a cold, inquiring touch on my cheek, followed by the wet slap of a tongue and the pungent smell of kibble breath. Pepper? I was awake now, and it all rushed back to me. I had let Pepper back in before the storm started, before I drifted off to sleep on the couch. In fact, I'd had to move my legs out to make room for him between myself and the backrest. And now, with my eyes adjusted to the dark, just enough to see outlines, I could make out his shape, coiled into the far corner of cushions with my hand on his haunch. But his nose wasn't pressed to my cheek anymore. It angled instead to the dining room where Pepper had just run. But Pepper's right here. The whole thing flashed through my head again, waking up, seeing Pepper at the door, letting him in, and hearing him hurtle through the house and into the basement. Was it even real? Some half-awake sleepwalker's dream, maybe. I saw my phone then and snatched for it, flicking on the flashlight as quickly as I could. Sure enough, there was Pepper on the couch, pressed tightly into a defensive posture and trembling terribly, glancing back and forth between me and the dark outline of the dining room archway. He's just scared of the thunder. I made the rest of it up, right? To be sure, I dropped the beam of light from Pepper to the floor, swiveled around and began tilting my phone towards the back door. Brown, muddy paw prints. I gasped and moved forward, hunching over even more to get a better look. They were there all right, clear as day, and they looked like peppers, not only in size but in gait. I could see that there were only 3 paws. Quick math, that's 3 legs. And then I remembered seeing the big collar on him while he was outside, and hearing it clunk against the glass as he pawed away at the back door. They were Pepper's paw prints, and they did arrow towards and around the breakfast bar. He ran downstairs and then snuck back up. I just didn't see him. The mud had all stamped off by then, too. That's why there's no return trail. It's funny how our mind comes up with impossible explanations to keep us sane in the face of the unknown and the unnatural. Still, I began to walk along the path of paw prints, hunched over with my phone held down almost to the ground, looking like some sort of Sherlock Holmes caricature. I don't think I really wanted to, and I don't think I was being brave, but maybe I was. I just wanted answers. Not just my answers. The right ones, the safe, normal ones. Just past the breakfast bar, the prints started looking different. At first I thought they were just smudging, that most of the mud had already stamped off into the tile, just as I'd expected, my dear Watson. But that didn't seem quite right. No, not smudging. It was more like they were changing, elongating on some and widening on others, digits growing longer, and the entire print becoming larger as I moved further down the line. And then I was through the archway and into the dining room, turning left to cast light down the basement stairwell, and on the stairs leading down into the dark. They were no longer Pepper's paw prints or unknown smudges. They were human, prints from bare hands and feet. Whatever had run down there certainly wasn't Pepper. What did it look like now? I snapped to attention, but kept the light shining down the stairs, fully expecting someone, or something that only looked like someone, to vault up towards me. "What do you want?" It was the only thing I could think to say, and it came out more of a whisper than a question. There was an eternity of silence, no more than a few seconds long, and then a response floated back up the stairs, sounding almost like last words wheezed from the throat of a dying man. "We don't like the rain either." Any bravery I'd contained up to that point evacuated me with the contents of my bladder. I turned around and floored it back into the living room, grabbed Pepper, the real Pepper, by the collar and dragged him out of the front door, through the rain and into my car, where I called the police. And where I'm writing this now, in hindsight, I should have just told the dispatcher that I had an intruder. But I was so frazzled and confused and horrified that I just blabbered the whole thing out. She was nice enough to let me finish, but just told me to eat something and get some sleep before hanging up. So here I am in the driveway, sitting in my car with my shivering Doberman on my pee-soaked lap, too scared to go back into my house, but with nowhere else to go, and looking for help. What did I let into my house? And how do I get it out? I'm an undergraduate civil engineering student at a college. I won't say which one specifically, but it's in the northeastern United States. I share my apartment with one other person, Hall. She's a biomedical engineering major. Neither of us were perfect roommates, obviously, but I'd say we're pretty good friends, having bonded over the difficulty of freshman year engineering courses 3 years ago. 2 nights ago, I was sitting on our couch when Hall came out of her room, looking ready to head out somewhere. "Where are you headed?" I asked absent-mindedly, focused more on the Mario Kart race I was currently winning than on her. Dr. Evans sent out an email the other day. She's running some kind of extra credit lab tonight. "Marshall, I swear to God this is going to suck, and I don't really want to go, but I could use the points." She replied, sounding tired. "Alright, have fun, I guess." Whenever you get back, I'm pretty sure you're legally obligated to play a few races. I gestured at the TV as I crossed the finish line in first place. Yeah, sure, as long as you're cool with losing, she answered, already halfway out the front door. I got back to my game after she left. I played for a few more hours, tucking this weird late-night lab she mentioned to the back of my memory. I know she had mentioned that she was practically failing this Dr. Evans class. It was like an epidemiology class or something, so I could at least understand why she needed the extra points. But it had to have been around 8:30 p.m. when she left, and having a lab that late was definitely not normal. I lost track of time for the next few hours, and before I realized it, it was almost midnight. I headed over to the kitchen, threw a frozen meal in the microwave, and thought about texting Hall to make sure she was okay when I heard the front door open. I looked out to the living room, and there she was. She looked like a mess. Her hair was wild, and she was all scratched and bruised. A large blood stain on the front of her t-shirt. "You okay? You look like you got in a fight or something," I asked, worried, as I reached into the freezer and tossed her an ice pack. The ice pack flew through the air, across our living room, and smacked into her chest before falling to the ground. She made no attempt to catch it, instead standing still and staring at me wide-eyed. Then she gave me a wide-open mouth smile and walked to her room. The way she moved was wrong, though. Every single movement was incredibly sudden and jerky. I figured she was tired and maybe tripped and hurt herself or something. I don't know. I asked her multiple times what was wrong, if she was okay, and about 100 other things to that effect. But she didn't reply and just stayed in her room for the rest of the night. I assumed she just needed a break and went to bed shortly after. The next morning, I rolled out of bed around 10 a.m. and started getting ready for class. The whole time I got ready, Hall's door stayed closed, her room quiet. I figured I'd let her sleep in without being disturbed. I went to all my lectures that day, which caused me to return to the apartment at a little after 5 p.m. The door to Hall's room was still closed, and her backpack was still exactly where it was that morning, so it was safe to assume she hadn't gone anywhere yet. "Hall, you need to come out at some point, or I'm gonna assume you're actually dead," I yelled from the living room. "Could you at least say something so I know that you're okay?" I waited for a moment, hoping I'd at least hear a grunt in response or anything indicating she was fine. After about a minute of waiting and getting nothing, I decided I was going to check on her. She's been known to sleep in sometimes, but this seemed a bit excessive. I went over to her door and knocked, a reflexive courtesy, I guess, but after the very first knock, the door swung open, and Hall was standing there staring at me. Once again, her eyes were wide and her mouth was open, in a over-exaggerated smile. I won't say it wasn't a little creepy for sure. "Hall, about time you answered. Starting to think something was seriously wrong," I said with an edge of irritation creeping into my voice. "Yes, I am fine now," she answered slowly and deliberately, as though considering every word in her response. "Alright, do you need anything? I mean, you looked seriously messed up last night. What happened?" I had about 1,000,000 more questions about her behavior the last 12 hours or so, but she already seemed kind of drained and I didn't want to overwhelm her, so I just settled for those 2 big ones. I tripped at the lab and smashed some glass. I am going out now. I am so hungry. She responded, her words again distant and deliberate. I muttered out a quick protest, insisting that I would go out and get something to eat, and she could just chill in the apartment, since she didn't look much better than she did the night before. To be honest, she arguably looked worse than the previous night. She was still in her blood-soaked clothes, her eyes looked tired and cloudy, and her skin had noticeably paled. And yet, despite all my complaints, she completely ignored me and headed out the door. I just sort of stood there, stunned for a second before realizing she didn't take her phone with her. Usually I wouldn't have cared and let her figure it out on her own, but with how she had been the last day, I didn't want her to pass out or something and not have her phone to call for help. So I grabbed her phone, threw on my coat, and realized I didn't know where she's going. I almost texted her to ask her where she was headed, then realized, oh yeah, I have her phone. So I kinda just wandered around campus for a bit, checking out the 2 or 3 places I thought she might be, namely our favorite hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant and the nearby Chipotle, but had no luck. After about an hour of searching, I couldn't find her, so I headed home and gave campus police a call to let them know to be on the lookout for her, just to be safe. A few hours had passed, and the only updates I had gotten from the campus cops were basically that they had heard nothing. I waited on the couch until around midnight, hoping she'd come home at some point, and I accidentally fell asleep. I was woken up suddenly at a little after 2 a.m. by a scream. High-pitched and agonized, ringing out over and over. The voice didn't particularly sound like Hall's, but I would have been stupid not to check it out, so I immediately grabbed the knife we kept by the door and headed out behind the dingy apartment building. As I was rushing out, the person kept screaming, pleading for help from anyone and anything. I whipped around the corner and looked down the alley behind the building, and what I saw was hard to make out initially, but when I did, it sickened me. I did see Hall, but she wasn't the one screaming. The one screaming was another guy who lived in the building, maybe like 2 or 3 units down from Hall and I. I think his name was Henry, maybe. Whatever his name was. He was laying on the ground, limbs splayed, and it looked like one of his legs was broken. Hall was on top of him, teeth digging deep into his stomach, tearing into him like a starving wild animal. Blood sprayed out of his body, with him screaming and trying to fight Hall off to no avail. After what felt like an eternity, he fell limp and lifeless. Seemingly satisfied with what she had done, Hall regurgitated something up into the open wound where his stomach was. It looked almost like a golf ball, but made of some fleshy material with veins running along it in all directions. I'm ashamed to say I maybe could have helped the poor guy. Based on his screaming, he was alive for the majority of that. I had a knife, I maybe could have gotten Hall off of him, but I just couldn't bring myself to help. I just hid around the corner trying not to have a breakdown. After she was finished, she waited there for a long, drawn-out minute. Then his body started to move with the same jerky motions I had seen Hall moving with before. Almost like a puppet being drawn up by its strings. He stood up, seemingly undisturbed by his bleeding gut or broken leg. I feel much better, he muttered in a similar glossy, distant cadence. Good, spread the feeling. Hall replied to him, still not sounding or speaking quite like herself, but sounding much closer than she did before. That's the thing that worried me most. She seemed much more coherent, and better at sounding like herself. Just as I was about to run out of there, ready to run from whatever terrifying attack I just saw, and never come back, Hall's phone went off in my pocket. Her loud ringtone that I had heard 1,000 times now ringing out through the otherwise quiet night. I silently swore and tried to quickly silence it. Both Hall and the other guy's heads snapped in my direction immediately, catching a glimpse of me before I could finally duck back around the corner. Marshall, was that you? The thing that had replaced Hall called out, and she slowly started walking up the alley towards me. We can make you feel better, the other one called out. its speech still noticeably worse than the one that had replaced Hall. "Marshall, it'll be good for you," the first one called out as she continued to move closer. I was paralyzed with fear for a moment, trying to will myself to run with no success. It was only when Hall was about halfway to me, and she started running, did my fear paralysis shake off. I ran away from the apartment, dropping her still ringing phone as I did, and they both broke off in a dead sprint after me. I think Hall was keeping pretty good pace with me too. I was too scared of what I'd see to look back, but I could hear the footsteps slamming behind me, closer than I'd like. The other ones, whether he could feel the pain or not, his leg was still broken. It took about 3 or 4 awkward steps towards me before its leg buckled, collapsing in a heap on the ground. After running through the streets that were only kind of familiar for 5 minutes, I got tripped up on myself and fell to the ground hard. The thing that was imitating Hall was on top of me instantly, clawing at my chest with her nails and trying to fully pin me down. Panicking, I lashed out with my legs and planted a foot in Hall's chest, knocking her off of me for only a few seconds. The few seconds was all I needed to grab the knife and plunge it into her upper thigh over and over again. Feeling confident that she could no longer chase me, but not wanting to stick around, I continued running for another 20 minutes, fueled by nothing but cortisol and adrenaline. I ran until I got to my friend Devin's dorm on the other side of campus, and frantically pounded on the door until he let me in. I must have looked terrible, panicked and bleeding from my partially sliced open torso. Devin could tell that something was up and told me I could stay with him for a few days. I thought about calling campus police, but thought against it, as it would probably incriminate me more than anything else. I needed to get away from that place. I don't know if something happened to Hall at that night lab she went to, or if the night lab was even a real thing, but I just need to get out of here. I don't know if these things are going to spread the feeling to the whole campus, but I'm not staying around to find out. Living on this street has always been synonymous with peace. My name is Lucas, and just like my routine, my life unfolds peacefully in a small town. I usually take long walks amidst nature, bask in the sun, and enjoy life as I work from home. However, my family is the opposite. They thrive on hustle, noise, and crowds. Personally, I don't know how they manage it, but since the feeling is mutual, I let it be. Because of this, I moved here and adopted a cat to not feel so lonely, and it was one of the best choices I ever made. Mr. Muchkin was perfect, almost human-like in intelligence. He knew how to take care of his business in our backyard, burying it far away from home, and he even hunted some rats or other animals that might steal food. As I said, small-town life. His company was comforting, especially on silent summer nights when I sat on the porch, gazing at the stars in the clear sky alongside him. However, things began to change. A new family moved into the house next door, the Petersons. They were normal, too normal. That's what bothered me. I saw them arriving in their moving truck, a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter, all impeccable. The father in a well-pressed suit, the mother with a radiant smile, wearing a flared dress and an apron, the son with his school backpack, a uniform from some baseball team, and the daughter in her princess dress. It was what one would expect from a movie family, like asking an AI to create a family without giving specific details. It was somehow eerie. The following days were as usual, with Mr. Muchkin patrolling the backyard and me working on my projects. However, I began to notice small changes. Mr. Muchkin started to act more reclusive, skittish. He used to come running to greet me when I came home, but now he seemed to avoid my presence. Not just mine. He stopped visiting the yard as often. I even had to buy a litter box, since it had been a while since I had to worry about that. Initially, I attributed this to some minor incident, or maybe the presence of the new neighbors, perhaps an indisposition. Speaking of the Petersons, well, I'm not one to pry or anything, but it was hard not to notice. They were rarely seen leaving the house, almost always keeping the curtains closed. At night sometimes, I heard murmurs coming from their house, as if they were talking quietly. The last straw of oddity was when I saw Mr. Peterson sitting in the backyard, alone on a full moon night. He was facing away from me, but his rigid posture and the way he remained motionless sent shivers down my spine. It seemed like he was staring fixedly into the darkness. Disturbing. The next day, Mr. Muchkin disappeared. I was worried because although, as I mentioned, he did his patrols, they were always within our property, behind the fences, and he always came back every night to sleep at my feet. I decided to search for him around the neighborhood, calling his name in vain. I asked the neighbors, except the Petersons, but no one had seen anything. I was truly desperate. I knocked on the door of the house next door, hoping to find some clue in the last place I wanted to be. Mr. Peterson answered, with his customary smile, hair clinically aligned and mustache brushed. When I asked if they had seen my cat, he hesitated for a moment before responding. "Oh, Mr. Muchkin, is it? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I've seen him around here, but we'll keep an eye out, okay? I'm sure he'll turn up." His response was polite, but there was something off. He finished speaking and stood there, still, inert, looking at me. A strange feeling that something was wrong. Still, I thanked him and stepped back. Despite Mr. Peterson's seemingly reassuring words, a sense of unease settled within me. His smile seemed forced, and his eyes moved rapidly, making me uncomfortable. I might be becoming paranoid, but something about that encounter wasn't right. I decided to follow my instinct, and that afternoon, when the street was deserted and the Petersons were out, I decided to investigate. I saw their car turning the corner at the end of the street, all four of them inside. Silence reigned in the house. I cautiously entered their backyard, feeling guilty for doing so, but the concern of Mr. Muchkin and the thought of what might be happening to him outweighed my hesitation. The house was as immaculate inside as it was outside, with furniture and details that seemed to have come out of a home decor magazine. It was such an artificial perfection that I felt like I was in a sitcom set. As I rummaged through the rooms of the house, however, the feeling of being watched haunted me. Every sound made me shudder. Every shadow made me jump. I looked through the living room, kitchen, even ventured into the bedrooms, where I was disturbed to see what Mr. and Mrs. Peterson had hidden. Numerous family portraits. I almost closed the door in shock when I saw the gaze of all of them was directed towards the door. I began to notice something strange about them. In all of them, the people were the same, but the surroundings weren't. Wow, you might be thinking. What's so strange about that? Wouldn't it be weird to have thousands of photos with the same setting? And you would be right, but this case was exceptional. The photos seemed very, very old. There were things from the 80s, 70s, 60s. I even found a hand-painted portrait from that time before the photos. And in all of them, they were the same, as if they didn't age. It was when a noise snapped me out of this trance. A muffled, low but unmistakable sound. A meow. I was tense but also relieved to hear the meow. It was proof that Mr. Muchkin was somewhere around. I followed the sound and it led me to a fearful place, one that I had been deliberately avoiding. The basement. The meows intensified as my steps approached. I don't know how many of you have cats, but they meow differently depending on the situation, and my little feline friend was meowing in fear. It was urgent. I opened the creaky door, greeted by a gust of hot, humid air, a strong smell of mold. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended slowly, my accelerated breath echoing in the emptiness. I followed the meow, now clearer. I supposed he was huddled in a corner, scared, so I began to head towards the back of the room. But then, my eyes started to adjust, slowly, to the darkness. I stopped walking. My heart raced. I had to appear calm, but now, panic had consumed my mind. My chest began to heave as I breathed in more and more of that intoxicating air. I saw, with the little light I had, a figure, strange, contorted, but much larger than a cat. It had something resembling a head, which began to turn towards me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt they were on me. I saw it move, opening its mouth, and then a meow sound echoed from its throat. This time I could hear it clearly, and it was much deeper, distorted. "I'll be back, Mr. Munchkin." I stuttered as I backed away, still facing the thing. But when I saw it move, I ran without even looking back, slamming the basement door and jumping out of the side window of the house as fast as I could. However, my great panic came now. As I jumped over the Petersons' fence and finally entered my backyard, I saw a furry, small, curious figure on the balcony railing. It was Munchkin, wagging his fluffy tail. He looked at me, tilting his head in curiosity. I looked back, seeing the fence, imagining what was on the other side. I ran upstairs to where my cat was. He snuggled against my hand, purring. "Where have you been, buddy?" My phone vibrated. It was a message from the lady from the next street, Lord's. "Hey dear, your cat showed up here this morning, but I couldn't reach you. I gave him food and helped him over the fence. I saw the lights turning on. Are you home? Is he okay?" "Yeah, Mrs. Lords. Thank you so much." I closed the phone. Now me and Munchkin are here on the second floor. The sun has set, and now we only have the pale light of the moon. It's one of those warm nights, but we're not looking up at the sky, but down. The Petersons' car is parked in front of the house. They've been there for almost an hour now, sitting motionless like dolls, except for Mr. Peterson, who is now staring directly at us.